right in the middle of a civil war, we're going to have a presidential election, the election of 1864. And it's an unusual election because we have a divided union now. We have 11 states that have seceded from the union, right? So we got to figure out how this is going to go. But the presidential election doesn't stop in America because of this secession and the Civil War. Because you have to elect a new president every 4 years or re-elect one. Well, in this case, in the election of 1864, the Republican Party is going to nominate President Lincoln for re-election. Remember, he was elected in 1860. And his running mate for the vice presidency in 1864 is going to be Andrew Johnson, which is going to be a pretty important name here, because when Lincoln is assassinated later in the lectures, this is the guy that's going to be taking over and trying to reconstruct the country, which is not an easy job. So the Republicans nominate President Lincoln for the presidency, re-election, and his running mate will be Andrew Johnson. Now, the unusual thing about Andrew Johnson is he's a former Democratic congressman from Tennessee. So you have a Republican presidential nominee, but yet his vice president is going to be a Democrat, which is a little bit unusual. And Lincoln did that purposely because of the situation we're in. Okay? Now remember, Tennessee is now under the control, are they not, of Union forces? Okay? So, it'll be Lincoln for the Republicans for president and Andrew Johnson for the Republicans for vice president, despite the fact that Johnson is a former Democratic congressman from Tennessee. Anybody want to guess who the Democrats nominated? Has to do with the Civil War. Hard to, this is kind of unusual. Somebody we've talked about in the Civil War here is going to be the Democratic nominee. What's that? No, it's a good guess, but not Grant, but a Union general.
Lee or Ewell, somebody like that?
No, a Union general.
Oh.
George McClellan. Yeah, George McClellan is going to be the Democratic nominee for president. So a guy that's a military man in service to the military during the Civil War is going to be the Democratic Party nominee. His running mate will be G.H. Pendleton, who is from Ohio. So for the Republicans, you've got a Lincoln Johnson ticket, and for the Democrats, you've got a McClellan Pendleton ticket. Now, a little bit about G.H. Pendleton, it'll ring a bell to you. He was a very good politician. He served in both the House and the Senate from Ohio, so he's a good politician. And he was the son-in-law of Francis Scott Key, who wrote the Star-Spangled Banner. Kind of interesting. So, anyway, G.H. Pendleton was a good politician. He had served in both houses of Congress from Ohio, House and Senate. He probably would have been a better presidential candidate than McClellan, but I think the Democrats thought McClellan had the name. But G.H. Pendleton, again, served in both houses of Congress from Ohio, and he was the son-in-law of Francis Scott Key, who wrote the Star-Spangled Banner. Speaking of the Star-Spangled Banner, this is way off touch last night, but Caitlin Cottrell sent me a picture last night. She went to the Sheridan basketball game with the Baumstark family, and she sent me a picture of the Star-Spangled Banner being played. Cody was the only one on his team that had his hand over his heart last night. Really. She sent me the picture. I was very impressed. Here he is right in the middle, 6'7" or whatever he is, and he's got his hand over his heart. None of the other players all got their heads behind their back, including coaches. So I thought that was kind of impressive. Anyway, off the cuff. The Democrats were kind of running on an anti-war campaign. And they thought if they were anti-war, that, hey, Lincoln isn't getting the job done in the Civil War, that they might win by getting the votes of those people who did not see war as being successful. Now, what's Lincoln and the Republicans running on? What happened that might think that the war is coming to an end? What major city was captured by William Sherman? Well, that was Grant, actually. What's that? Atlanta. So Lincoln and the Republicans are hoping that General Sherman's capture of Atlanta had convinced most voters that, hey, this war is about over. Okay? Now, this election was the first time that 3 states ever voted in a presidential election. Okay? Because they were new states. Kansas, West Virginia, remember who had split off from Virginia when Virginia seceded from the Union? And Nevada. Those were the 3 states that this would be the first time they would be sending electors, or they would be voting in a presidential election. Kansas, because they had been a territory before, right? West Virginia, who had split off from Virginia when they seceded from the Union, and Nevada. So what you have in essence is, with the addition of those 3 states, the number of states who are going to participate in this election is 25. Is that all the states we have? 25? Actually, we have 36. So what about those 11 that seceded from the Union? What's going to happen with those particular states? Are they going to be able to vote in this election? Well, yes and no. There were 9 states that did not participate. And you don't have to write them down, just listen. Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, Arkansas, and Texas did not vote, those 9 states. Why? Because they were not under the control of Union forces at the time. There were 2 states that were. Come on now, be good here. What 2 states that seceded from the Union is the Union having control of?
Tennessee and Mississippi.
Tennessee and close. Louisiana. So Union forces were in total control of Tennessee and Louisiana. So they voted. However, they didn't count their votes in their final results because they still considered them a seceded state. So they let them vote, but they didn't count. So kind of picture this in your mind. 25 states counted in this election. The 9 states that seceded from the Union, that the Union did not have control of, did not vote. The 2 Confederate states that the Union did have control of, they let them vote, but they didn't count the results.
Why didn't they try to make their votes count, all get together as the South and vote against Abraham Lincoln?
Well, because they didn't even recognize that they could vote because they had seceded. Good question. Yeah, they didn't want them to vote. They did let the other 2 vote, they had control, but they didn't count them. So really what you have is these northern states. What's that?
Why'd you let them vote?
Oh, I don't know if it was, I really don't know why they did that. To show that, hey, you know, we've got control of you, you're gonna vote, but then we're not gonna count. I'm not sure why. Well, anyway, in the long run, Lincoln just crushed McClellan. Of the 224 possible electoral votes, of the 224 you could get, if you got them all, McClellan got 12. Which meant that Lincoln got 212. So of the possible 224 electoral votes possible in this election, Lincoln gets 212 and McClellan gets 12. So Lincoln is re-elected on the basis, and I think most Americans believe, that maybe this thing is winding down, okay? All right, that'll take us to our next subtopic, which is the Deep South falls to the Union. The Deep South falls to the Union. Does anybody remember in your notes when Sherman left Chattanooga, Tennessee, and began his assault of the Deep South? Anybody have that particular date in front of them? May of '64, wasn't it? Because Grant was named overall commander March 9th, right? And in May he started. Well, in December of 1864, late December of 1864, General Sherman sent a telegraph to the newly re-elected President Lincoln. Okay? So in late December of 1864, Sherman sends a telegraph to the newly re-elected President Lincoln. And the telegraph states, quote, "I beg to present you as a Christmas gift the city of Savannah, Georgia." So it tells Lincoln that he has penetrated through Georgia and not only taken Atlanta, but Savannah as well. So in late December 1864, General William Sherman sends a telegraph to the newly re-elected President Lincoln, and the telegraph states, "I beg to present you as a Christmas gift the city of Savannah." So, in essence, by January 1st of 1865, both Atlanta and Savannah had fallen, right? By January 1st of 1865, the Deep South had been penetrated by Union forces and swept completely clean. And the biggest problem for the Confederates by January 1st of 1865 is their government was bankrupt. They had no money. So, by January 1st of 1865, the Confederacy really is all but defeated. Atlanta and Savannah have fallen to the Union. The Deep South had been penetrated by Union forces and swept completely clean. And the Confederate government was bankrupt. Now, if you're Confederate President Jefferson Davis, what do you tell your men even though things look bleak? Continue to fight on until you can fight no more. And, pep talk them, so to speak, into not giving up. Even though things were looking tough, Confederate President Jefferson Davis was not ready to quit, and he told those rebel soldiers to continue to fight on until they could fight no more. Well, think about this. As Union General Sherman is marching closer and closer to Richmond from the south, Confederate General Lee's troops are getting thinner and thinner and thinner. Which takes us to our next subtopic, which is the surrender of both Petersburg and Richmond. The surrender of both Petersburg and Richmond. Coming to an end here, kiddos. So as I mentioned, Union General Sherman is marching closer and closer to Richmond from the south. Confederate General Lee's troops are getting thinner and thinner. He's running out of men. And Grant has ordered Union General Philip Sheridan and his army to close in on Richmond from the north as Sherman is approaching from the south. So Sherman is now where? In Virginia. Okay? So at this point, Ulysses S. Grant, overall commander, orders Union General Philip Sheridan and his army to close in on Richmond from the north as Sherman approaches Richmond from the south. Well, at this point, in early April of 1865, General Lee is low on food, he's low on supplies, he's low on soldiers. And as a result of that, in April of 1865, he is forced to abandon Petersburg, Virginia, which is close to Richmond. So low on food and soldiers and supplies, General Robert E. Lee is forced to abandon Petersburg, Virginia in early April of 1865. So Petersburg has fallen to the Union. For the same reasons, just a few days later, General Lee was forced to surrender Richmond as well. Just a few days after abandoning Petersburg, Because he's low on food, supplies, and soldiers, General Lee is finally forced to surrender Richmond. So after 4 long years of fighting, the Union finally captures the Confederate capital. Which leads us to our next subtopic, which is the Confederate surrender at Appomattox. Anybody know what Appomattox is? It's a town in Virginia. So the Confederate surrender at Appomattox. Well, simply after the surrender of Richmond, General Lee has no choice but to surrender the Confederacy to the Union. It's over. And so on April 7th of 1865, General Grant officially asks Lee to surrender. On April 7th of 1865, General Ulysses S. Grant formally asks Confederate General Robert E. Lee to surrender. General Lee takes 2 days of thought and preparation for surrender, and finally on April 9th of 1865, General Robert E. Lee agrees to General Ulysses S. Grant's terms of surrender. So Grant asks him to surrender and gives him the terms of surrender on the 7th. Lee looks at the terms of surrender, ponders his options, prepares himself, and 2 days later on April 9th of 1865, Robert E. Lee agrees to those terms. So on that date of April 9th, these 2 great Civil War generals meet at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia, to sign the terms of surrender. So on that same day of April 9th, 1865, General Ulysses S. Grant and Robert E. Lee meet at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia, to sign the terms of surrender. Kind of interesting on the appearance of these 2 generals. What might you expect these generals to look like, Brianna? What do you think when they're coming to surrender? What do you think Grant and Lee would look like? What's that? Well, it'd be exhaustive, but I mean, they're coming to a formal surrender, so what would their appearance? I should read it. Yeah, so let's give you the difference. Lee is dressed in full dress uniform with his jeweled sword at his side. I mean, he is dressed to the absolute T, formally, for this surrender. Okay, he's in full dress uniform, including his jeweled studded sword that he didn't really use in battle, did he? Something that he had part of his full dress uniform. So he looks the part. Grant, on the other side, is wearing a private's shirt, is unbuttoned at the neck, and he's got muddy boots. He doesn't look anything like a commander. And we'll kind of explain that to you when we get into lectures later about how he was in general. He was not a flashy dancer or dresser. He wasn't that type of guy. So while Lee is in full dress uniform with a jeweled studded sword at his side, Grant comes to the surrender in a private shirt, a shirt a private would wear, unbuttoned at the neck with muddy boots. He looks very undressed, I guess would be the best way forward. Well, at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9th, 1865, aided by his military secretary, Eli Samuel Parker, Grant drafts in front of Lee the terms of surrender. What I mean by drafts is he writes it down so it can be signed. So on that day, aided by his military secretary, Eli Samuel Parker, General Grant drafts the terms of surrender. In other words, What are the terms of surrender? What's going to happen to these Confederates when they surrender? How do you think Grant treated the Confederates on his terms of surrender? Good or honorable, or a little hardcore? What would you guess?
Honorable.
He was. The terms of surrender were very simple and very honorable. Very, very positive, I guess, for a country, so to speak, that lost. And it consisted of 3 parts. So here are the terms of surrender, which were considered by historians as simple and honorable. Number 1, these defeated Confederates would be required to sign pledges promising not to fight against the Union any longer. Okay? The defeated Confederates would be required to sign pledges promising not to fight against the Union any longer. Number 2, Confederate soldiers were required to surrender their weapons. Confederate soldiers were required to surrender their weapons. Confederate soldiers were required to surrender their weapons. Number 3, General Grant did allow Confederate officers to keep both their pistols and their swords. But what did they have to surrender? Any rifles. Any rifles. But he did allow Confederate officers to keep their pistols